Hello folks, this is Alasdair Post-Quinn from Fallingblox Designs. You can find me at double-knitting.com, and this is the Fallingblog podcast, episode 6. So, I'm trying some new stuff here, and I'm hoping that this is all going to work out. And one of the things that I'm trying here is a live to recorded model, so to speak. So what I'm doing here is I'm using a little tool called a Stream Deck, which allows me to do some of the things that I did in post-processing, but do it live. So let's hope that this works out. And feel free to toss something in the chat if you are having any trouble with this stream. One of the things that that I'm doing here is I'm trying to accept the imperfections. And one of the things that I ran into a lot was I noticed my own imperfections. I tend to pause, I tend to say and ah a lot, and I'd go back and I'd edit all that stuff out. Maybe you noticed, maybe you didn't. But it bothered me, and I know it bothered some people, and I'm just not going to let it bother me anymore because it's too much trouble to edit out, and it's not really important because the information is the same, and this is who I am. And this is how I sound. So I'm going to start with the Fallingblox Report, as I typically do these podcasts. So first, let me talk about the history of the podcast. So the original podcast was a live stream, much like this one, except it was on Facebook Live. And I started it shortly before the fire that took my house a couple of years ago. And I continued it after the fire, partially as a way to keep people updated on what was going on with that, and partially just as a way to keep body and soul together, you know. And those podcasts were difficult to do. The live streams were difficult to do, and some of them over time got better and cleaner, and eventually I moved from a live stream version to a more cleaner, potentially cleaner pre-recorded version. So that, however, doesn't really explain why this podcast was last seen in August, I think, of last year. I kind of got in a creative rut. The one pattern that I was really working on was I kept getting into creative blocks with it, and that was the Bocote hat, and you probably saw a number of mentions of it, and finally I opted to just sort of stop mentioning it until it was done. And that took me more months than I'd like to admit, and I got into a rut of, the perfect is the enemy of the good. I've said that a number of times, and this is the kind of thing that I needed to do in order to make sure that I can put out something good, even if it's not perfect. So the good thing that I'm doing, I hope, is I'm going to try to stick to a more regular schedule, and even if I don't have the I don't have anything to show in what's on my needles, I still have something to do in pattern focus and something to do in the technique for the month, if only that. So The other thing that was keeping me was that I really, really wanted to offer some good news on the house rebuild, and because things kept looking up and then our hopes were dashed again and again and again. So I'm reluctant to mention anything about the rebuild now in case I jinx it. But rest assured, as soon as I have some more good and or concrete news on that, it'll appear in a later report. So stuff that's actually an update about this, about Fallingblox, is the Wuxing 5 Elements collection is finally finished. It's been finished for a while, but if you're just looking at the podcasts, the last time I posted anything, the Bocote hat was not even remotely finished. And so, as you can see, it now is considerably more finished, and I'll talk more about it later. I am in the process of getting some more basic patterns knitted and released. There is the possibility of a new book in the future, about which more news later, in a later episode. I'm also looking forward to finally digging into some new technique development, some old technique expansion, and working on some new virtual workshops over the summer for release in the fall season. Speaking of which, workshops are now being recorded, if you hadn't heard, which means that if you enroll in a workshop, even if you don't make it to the workshop, you can still come and see it after the fact. And those recorded versions are going to stay up online at least 6 months, so they'll give you ample time to go check them out, or rewatch them if you did watch them the first time. If you want to check out more of my workshops coming up, I've got a bunch in March and April. Go to double-knitting.com/buildingblocks, and for live workshops, go to double-knitting.com/calendar. I don't have a lot of those because I'm not really pursuing them at the moment, but I do have the ones that I signed contracts on when we thought maybe the pandemic might be over by now. And the one that's really coming up is Interweave Yarn Fest in Denver, or not Denver, I'm flying into Denver, but in Loveland, Colorado. I did just come back from Red Alder in Tacoma, Washington, and it went really well, and I avoided getting COVID, so yay. So we're going to switch over to what's on my needles. And first up on what's on my needles is actually going to be the Bocote hat. It's off my needles, of course, but it has been on my needles for so long, and the last podcast had really just a strip of it finished. So you may have seen one of the little live streams that I did while I was working on it. I did a watch me work kind of thing. And I hope to do more of those, by the way, and probably on the Twitch platform. I'll put a link to my Twitch channel, which hasn't streamed yet, but if you go follow it, you'll see when it does. And I'm going to do more live watch me work sorts of things there. It seems to be a popular format on Twitch anyway. It's not really as good for doing this kind of thing. So anyway, the Bocote hat. This is it. As you can see, it's complete now. Let me get rid of that. There we go. That's better. As you can see, it is a hat made up of knots, or knot holes, as you like to think of them. This is the wood hat in the theme of the 5 elements, and this is kind of a it was a bit of a comedy of errors, and that's why it took so long, but it was a delight to make and a delight to design, and I really hope people enjoy making them. The other thing that I've got that is just off my needles, or actually not my needles at all, I had a sample knitter do it, is a completely new pattern called Tendrils, and this is it. This is a pattern made in a new yarn that I discovered at the Webs retreat last September. And this is another gradient. I really like working in gradients, and so we have a gradient that goes from red to purple. It's very subtle, and a solid that's just green. And this is a Rowan felted tweed, or felted tweed color, which is the new gradient line. They don't have as many of them as their normal line, but hopefully I'll have more in the future. Still, this is a brand new pattern. It's one of 3 that are going to be coming out in the next month or so. I've got 2 more being worked on by sample knitters. These were really just basic double knitting patterns using just 2-color charts. So these are intro level patterns, or at least 2 of them are. One of them has some increases and decreases to shape the tips of the scarf, but the rest of the scarf is just plain old double knitting. So yeah, again, this is Tendrils. It just came off my needles, or sorry, somebody else's needles. And thank you so much to the sample knitter who did this in record time. She's credited in the pattern. And the pattern is available now on Ravelry. There will be a link in the description of this video later. So other stuff that I'm working on. I have sort of a lull in design right now, and so I have cast on to work on some of my old patterns again. These are patterns that I didn't ever get back after the fire. So this is Spring Willow. You can't see very much of it at the moment, but the thing about Spring Willow is the final version of this was the first thing I ever did in double knit lace, and my concern with it was always that it was not open enough. It was, it's an open work pattern, but it wasn't open enough. And what I called for in terms of needles for this yarn was frankly a little too small. So I chose to go with the same yarn, exact same yarn, same colors and everything, just with larger needles. So I'm going to redo the sample for this. I never found somebody to do this one. There are sample knitters who volunteered to help replace a bunch of the patterns that didn't make it, or the samples that didn't make it out of the fire. And this one I never found somebody to work on, so I just eventually started working on it myself. So as you can see, it hasn't gone very far, but I'm looking forward to getting that done. The other thing has shown up on this podcast a number of times, and finally I got some significant work done on it while on the plane to Washington. Not a huge amount of work, but still there's more here to see than there was. This is the Phoenix scarf. And as you can see, I've gotten past the first set of overshot woven stuff, and it's not actually overshot woven at all. It's just using an overshot pattern translated into double knitting, and here of course is the other side of it. It's a little wrinkled up as it's been stuffed in a bag, but it'll block out. So yes, that is Phoenix, so called partially because of the colors and partially because this was the first yarn that I received as a gift after the house burnt down, and so Phoenix from the Ashes is the full name of this one. So this is a good segue into my pattern focus segment. And the pattern focus today is going to be Parallax 2.0. As you can see in the background of the pattern focus little window here. So 2.0 is my bias knit parallax pattern, and to explain that a little bit, I'm going to go into a little explanation of the Parallax concept to begin with. So the parallax patterns are something that I call metapixel knitting, and I even have a website called I think it's metapixels.net. It's been a while since I looked at it, but I'll make sure to get the URL correct in the description. Still, metapixels are it's a term that I came up with to talk about pixels made up of pixels. So if you think about a standard knitting chart as something that is made up of individual squares, and those squares go together to make up a picture, that is indeed what pixels are. Pixels are picture elements in computer lingo. And a picture element is just, a square that with other squares goes together to make a picture. Usually they're colored squares, and they're so tiny you can't see them, so that your eye is fooled into thinking that this video is actually a moving a set of moving pictures and audio. Whereas, well, okay, the audio doesn't really matter, but the moving pictures are, of course, just pixels moving around and changing colors, and your eye thinks of it as a moving picture. So anyway, getting back to metapixels. Metapixels are what happens if each of those pixels is potentially larger than a single dot or a single square. So a pixel can be 1 by 1, but it could also be 1 by 2 or 2 by 2 or 3 by 3 or 5 by 8 or whatever. But each individual pixel is still all the same color. So if you change the x and y dimensions of your pixels, you can get something like the parallax patterns. So parallax patterns are based partially or inspired partially from op art from the 60s, as well as overshot weaving, which, as you saw in the previous segment, is something that I'm working on drawing the parallels to a lot more closely now. But this photo here is Parallax 0.5, and this was not actually the first parallax. The first one, great, oops. Little slideshow issue here, sorry about that. Okay, the first one was Parallax 1.0. So if you look really closely at this one, and I'll show a more close-up version of it in a minute, but if you look closely at this is all done in twisted stitches. That was my prevalent method of double knitting at the time I designed it. None of the others are done in twisted stitches, which can pretty well show you that this was the first one that came out. Or at least the first one on my needles. As a matter of fact, the first one that came out was Parallax 0.5, and they've all got version numbers rather than names, so I didn't have to come up with a new name. So 0.5, this one, was the first one to be released because while I was working on 1.0, I ended up in the booth of Bijou Basin Ranch, and I was selling my books through them, and I wanted to work on a pattern that I was in the middle of, and they said, well, we'd love to have you working on something while in the booth, but it has to be in one of our yarns. So obviously this is not in one of their yarns, this is in County, but I quickly drew up an idea for a different parallax, what became Parallax 0.5, and that was what I worked on for that weekend while I was in their booth. So Parallax 0.5 actually ended up being the first finished and first released as a standalone pattern well before the rest of them came out. So the Parallax 2.0, of course, is what I wanted to talk about today. Parallax 2.0 came out because I had the expansion points and the compression points focused on in the previous two patterns. So the compression points are those points where the metapixels get smaller. And you can see in this piece, they're the that sort of starburst looking pattern. And the expansion points are where the metapixels get larger, and you can see this sort of pillow looking thing in the opposite locations from the starbursts. So if I wanted to do this in a standard double knit piece without any shaping in it or anything like that, I would have ended up having to make it twice as wide, or at least 1.5 times as wide. So I didn't want to do that. I wanted to keep it at the, roughly scarf width, 8-ish inches wide. And so I chose to go on the bias with it. So some challenges, obviously, for going on the bias in double knitting is not really any different from going on the bias in single layer knitting. But with the color work that I was trying to add in here, what I ended up with was an increase on one edge and a decrease on the other of every other row. So on the shaping rows, on the rows in which there was an increase on one edge and a decrease on the other, the decreases are easy. You just take something away. But when you do an increase, you have to figure out what to add. It's not just a question of adding a stitch or a pair in this case. You are adding a new piece of the pattern. And so the pattern has to continue, and you have to be sure that you are adding the correct color. The other thing that was a challenge here, and it may not be immediately obvious because I think I did a pretty good job, is if you look at the beginning and the end, I still am ending up with something pretty close to a right-angled, flat-ended scarf. And that was, to some degree, a bit of trial and error, because what I had to do was figure out how to increase from a point and decrease back down to a point in order to make it look as if I was getting a flat beginning and end. There actually is no actual cast on or bind on. Well, I mean, there's a cast on, but it's very, very tiny. There's no real long cast on edge or long bind off edge with this. The bind off is just a cinch of the last one or two pairs, and the cast on similarly is just a few pairs to begin with. And then increasing at a particular rate to simulate a right angle from that corner. And the rate is going to be different because the shape of the bottom of stitches and the shape of increases made from, or the shape of increases versus the shape of the top of a stitch and the shape of decreases. They're all different. So the end result is that the way the decreases are done and the way the increases are done are also different. So I eventually took a picture of this on, and this was photographed in 2014, on one of the statues in the Boston Common. And these statues are, I actually don't even remember the theme. I'll have to look them up again. It's actually mentioned in the book. But if memory serves, this one is called Religion. And you can see he's sort of in supplication here. But now he's wearing a scarf. So the original plan came sort of as an accident. I was on the way back from another photo shoot where I was working with an actual model, not a statue, and I came across these statues in Davis Square, and I threw Parallax 0.5 onto one of them in 2012, and I took a picture, and it ended up being a really good photo and a really good model for, or I don't mean model as in a replacement for a live human, although that is actually also what it is, but a model for photographing my pieces. I ended up using statues around Boston to do, or the Boston area, to do photos of a number of pieces, and this was the first one. And then this is 1.0 and 3.0. You already saw 2.0. So 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0 were already done. Were all done roughly at the same time, and the photo shoot was done in 2014 on one of the coldest days. And so the entire photo shoot was basically me climbing up, throwing scarves around, tying knots, jumping down, taking a few shots, repeat. It took me about 10 minutes. I had to do it because I had a real camera with my hands exposed, which means that eventually they got numb, and I had to go back, run back into the subway and get out of the cold. So so the entire photo shoot took entirety of like 10 minutes, and then it was done, and they all came out really well, and you can see them all in the Parallax collection on my on my website, etc. So, whoops, excuse me. I'm still working out the Stream Deck here, so so apologies for little glitches in the in the picture when I hit the wrong button. So I didn't initially plan to do this signal boost, but while I don't have something knitting related to signal boost, I do want to call out a charity that I think you ought to donate to. And predictably, given the times that we are in, it's going to be a Ukraine charity. And there is a Ukraine charity called Razom for Ukraine, which is run by Ukraine Americans and is dedicated entirely to promoting democracy and independence in Ukraine. I don't need to go into any great detail about why Ukraine right now. If you watch any piece of the news that isn't Russian propaganda, you are probably very well informed on what's going on over there. And you know, I would love it if we were paying as much attention to atrocities happening to non-white people all over the world too, but I do have to say that this one is scarier than most, simply because of the nuclear threat. And so, you know, give money, give assistance, give anything you can. You know, if the nuclear bombs start falling, it won't matter what kind of money you have anyway, so give what you can. So again, Razom for Ukraine. There are plenty of other charities doing doing stuff for Ukraine, but this one's run by Ukrainians, so I think it's a good choice if you don't know what else to do. So last thing I'm going to do here is my technique of the month, and the technique of the month this time is going to be increases. Lifted increases, single lifted increases. And what I'm going to do here actually is I'm going to do this so that I can, as easily as possible, cut a chunk out of this podcast and post it directly to YouTube. I mean, it's already on YouTube, but people like to have the techniques in a form that they don't have to watch through an entire podcast or scroll through a podcast in order to get to. So I'm going to do a title slide here, and then basically it's going to look a lot like the videos that you've seen on my channel before. But do stay tuned. I'm going to do a little farewell at the end of it, but basically this is the last segment of this podcast. And here we go. This is Alasdair Post-Quinn from Fallingblox Designs. You can find me online at double-knitting.com. This is going to be a video on double knitting lifted increases. As you can see, what I have here is a small segment of double knitting with a couple of little vertical stripes. And the vertical stripes are currently 1 pair wide. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase them to 2 pairs wide. It's very simple. And I have to get up to the increase first, so I'm going to do a linked pair. If you are not familiar with the linked pair, I have another video about this. It goes into great detail on it. And then a couple of plain pairs to get up to the point where the next thing on my needle is that vertical stripe, that first vertical stripe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a lifted increase. A lifted increase is a relatively hole-free, highly directional increase. And so we have a left lifted increase and a right lifted increase. The left lifted increase works off of the left leg, and the right lifted increase works off the right leg. So since the first thing that I'm encountering here is a right leg, I'm going to do a right lifted increase. Now, one little terminology change that you might not be familiar with is the terms that I'm going to use are inside and outside. Rather than front and back. And the reason I use inside and outside rather than front and back is that inside is the space between the layers. It's behind the knits and in front of the purls. So inside and outside is the either front or back, depending on which layer you're on. Inside to outside on the front will look like this. Inside to outside on the back will look like this. Of course, it'll be a little more elegant when I actually pick up the correct leg. So, what we're going to do now is we're going to do a BA pair. We're going to increase into the same color that we're creating the increase with. You don't have to do that, but I find it's cleaner. It looks better. So we're going to start off with a knit side right lifted increase. And then we're going to follow it up with a purl side right lifted increase before we do anything with the next pair. So what you're going to do is you're going to use your right hand needle to go into the stitch 1 below the next stitch on your left hand needle. And so this is the stitch, this is 1 below, and you're going to go into that from inside to outside, like this. Once you've got that on the needle, you're going to put your left needle into the front of that, which puts you in position for a knit through the back of the loop. You'll finish the knit through the back of the loop. There you are. What this should get you is a nicely twisted loop that you're increasing into. If you've got a big open loop here, it means that you either picked that up in the wrong direction, outside to inside, or you didn't work it through the back of the loop. So then we're going to go on and do the purl side version of that. So yarn is to the front, flip the work upside down a little bit, and again using your right hand needle, you're going to look for the corresponding stitch on the other layer. So this, there we go, this stitch. And you want to make sure you just go through the one stitch, not through the stitch and something below it, for example, just the one stitch on its own. And again, you're going to go through its right leg from inside to outside. Once you've got that on the needle, you can put your hands back in normal position, put your left hand needle through the back of that loop, which positions you for a normal purl. And then finish the purl. I'll flip that over and you can see that I have a mirror image version, the same kind of twist as I had on the front. So once you've done that fully increased lifted, or fully increased pair, you can go on and do the next pair, the pair that is on top of the column that you increased into. So I'm just going to do 3 pairs here because the next one that I want to do is a left lifted increase, which means that I want to get to the far side of the next column. So I have just finished the next column, and I'm now going to do a left lifted increase. Predictably, since I used the right needle and went into the right leg of the stitch here, I'm going to use the left needle and go into the left leg, but I'm going to go into the stitch 2 below, not 1 below. And the reason that it's 2 below is because I just worked a new pair on top of this column, which means that in order to get to the same pair that I would have increased into in this, in the right lifted one, I have to count 1 further down. So here's 1, here's 1 below, here's 2 below. And just as before, you want to make sure that you're only going into the one stitch. It's very easy to catch the one above it as well. And as before, you're going inside to outside. Since it's already on your left-hand needle, you can just leave it there, and then you're going to knit it normally. This should feel twisted when you do it. You want it to be twisted because, again, you want that twisted loop that you're increasing into. Then, again, yarns to the front, and you're still going to use your left-hand needle. Flip the work upside down a little bit. Look for the corresponding stitch on the other layer. It's right here. And again, go from inside to outside with that, with your left-hand needle, and then put your hands back in normal position. With that loop already on your left-hand needle, you purl it through the back of the loop. So that gives you a nice little twisted increase here, and another one on this layer. So if you want more details about this, I do teach a workshop that goes into great detail about these increases and other types, including double decreases, these increases, as well as double increases, single decreases, double decreases. It's a class called Off the Grid Double Knitting, or Double Knitting Off the Grid, and it is something that I do on virtual workshops on a pretty regular basis. All right, so that was the technique of the month, and that's the end of the podcast. So thanks everybody for watching this. Thank you for those of you who decided to stick around and watch it live, and those of you who are watching it later, also thank you for tuning in. I'm going to try to do this, as I mentioned already, on a more regular schedule. I'm going to try to go for once a month. It's not necessarily going to be this specific day. I'll figure out a day for the future, and just stay tuned on my blog, my mailing list, Facebook page, etc. I will announce what the schedule is going to be going forward. I will at the very least have a Fallingblox report to give you some kind of update on what's going on in the world of Fallingblox and double knitting. A pattern focus and a technique of the month. I may have other things as well. So please stay tuned on this YouTube channel for more podcasts and other videos, and please also go check out my Patreon if you'd like to support me in a more direct and regular fashion. And don't forget that I'm doing virtual workshops on a regular basis and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future, even though I will be doing more live workshops, I'm sure, in 2023 and beyond. And these can be found on my calendar. Again, the link for that is going to be in the video description. So I will end that here, and thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next month.